One day, a high school senior named Alfonso Lopez brought a handgun to school. He was arrested and charged under the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. The act made it a federal crime to knowingly possess a firearm in a school zone. Following a bench trial, the federal district court convicted Lopez and sentenced him to prison. On appeal, Lopez argued that the act was unconstitutional because it exceeded Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. The Fifth Circuit agreed and reversed his conviction. The United States Supreme Court accepted the case to determine whether the Commerce Clause enabled Congress to prohibit gun ownership near schools. Writing for a 5-justice majority, Chief Justice Rehnquist concluded that the act was unconstitutional. Rehnquist explained that Congress can exercise its commerce power over 3 broad categories: the channels of interstate commerce, the instrumentalities of interstate commerce, and activities that substantially affect interstate commerce. Regulating gun possession near schools didn't involve either the channels of commerce or the instrumentalities of commerce. Therefore, the act was enforceable only if Congress had a rational basis for concluding that keeping guns away from schools had a substantial effect on interstate commerce. The United States argued that violent crime resulting from gun ownership near schools caused significant costs nationwide. Violent crime reduced people's willingness to travel to areas perceived as unsafe. Moreover, guns in schools threatened the learning environment, resulting in a less educated and less productive citizenry. Therefore, a rational basis existed for concluding that gun ownership near schools substantially affected interstate commerce. The court rejected the government's position because it suggested that Congress's commerce power had no clear limit. The court reasoned that the government's interpretation of the Commerce Clause would convert Congress's limited, enumerated power into a general police power. The Act's terms had nothing to do with commerce. The Act didn't contain a jurisdictional element which would have required federal prosecutors to link gun ownership to interstate commerce in each specific case. Furthermore, the Act and its legislative history didn't contain any express findings of fact regarding the effect of gun possession on interstate commerce. Thus, no rational basis existed for concluding that gun ownership near schools substantially affected interstate commerce. Therefore, the court affirmed the Fifth Circuit's conclusion that the act was unconstitutional. Justice Kennedy concurred, noting that both education and gun control were areas traditionally regulated by the states. The act deprived states of the opportunity to experiment with locally crafted solutions. Justice Thomas also concurred, but thought that the substantial effects test was too broad. The test conflicted with the historically narrow definition of commerce. Justice Stevens dissented, observing that future commerce necessarily depended upon providing the nation's children with a quality education. Justice Souter also dissented. Souter argued that the majority's test was a step backward to older, unsuccessful interpretations of the Commerce Clause, which relied on unworkable categorical distinctions. The lack of legislative findings didn't change the level of scrutiny either. While findings are helpful to the court's rational basis analysis, Congress is not obligated to render those findings to pass constitutional muster. Justice Breyer filed a third dissenting opinion. In determining an activity's effect on commerce, Breyer argued that courts should consider not just one instance of the activity, but instead the cumulative effect of all similar activities. The relevant question was not whether, in fact, the regulated activity substantially affected commerce, but whether Congress could have had a rational basis for concluding as much. For Breyer, the connection between preventing gun violence around schools and commerce was clear. Breyer cited extensive empirical evidence of gun violence in schools that interfered with delivering quality education. Given education's effect on commerce, Congress could have rationally found that gun violence in schools was a commercial problem. United States v. Lopez was the first time in over half a century that the court limited Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. Lopez dramatically redefined the balance between state and federal power and laid the basis for subsequent court rulings invalidating congressional attempts to regulate using the commerce power.